Who was Lot in the Bible? Abraham's nephew and his shocking story in the ancient world of the early 2nd millennium BC, when great civilizations rose along river valleys and nomadic clans moved across harsh landscapes, seeking pasture and survival. One man's choices would become a cautionary tale repeated for over 3,000 years. His name was Lot, nephew of the patriarch Abraham, survivor of divine judgment, father through incest, and ancestor of nations that would clash with Israel for centuries. His story contains elements so shocking that many assume they're exaggerations or later additions. The destruction of entire cities by fire from heaven, a wife transformed into a pillar of salt, daughters who conspired to intoxicate and seduce their own father. Yet these events, recorded in the book of Genesis chapters 11 through 19, form one of the most complete character arcs in biblical literature. A narrative of prosperity leading to compromise, compromise leading to catastrophe, and catastrophe revealing the depths of human desperation. Some claim Lot was a righteous man unfairly caught in divine wrath. Others paint him as weak, greedy, complicit in evil. Internet theories range from archaeological claims that Sodom has been definitely found in various locations, to assertions that Lot's wife was literally petrified by volcanic sulfur, to speculation that the cave incest was consensual rather than the daughter's desperate scheme. In this video, you're going to discover the actual biblical account of Lot's life, from his origins in Mesopotamia through his catastrophic choices in Canaan. Based directly on the Genesis text, the oldest surviving narrative source we possess, we'll examine what the text explicitly states, what it implies through literary structure, and where later traditions have added embellishments that the original never claimed. The biblical text introduces Lot with striking brevity in Genesis 11:27. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. That single verse establishes the essential fact. Lot was the son of Haran, making him Abraham's nephew. But this genealogy carries tragic weight. Verse 28 immediately records that Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth. In Ur of the Chaldeans, Lot's father died young. Before the family even left Mesopotamia, the text provides no details of Haran's death, no age, no circumstances, just the stark fact that in ancient Ur, in the shadow of the great ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nana, a son died before his father. Leaving a young boy without paternal protection, this loss shaped everything that followed. In the patriarchal clan structure of the ancient Near East, a fatherless nephew occupied a precarious position, though technically part of the extended family. He lacked the inheritance rights and direct lineage authority of a son. When Terah decided to leave Ur, taking Abram his son and Lot the son of Haran his grandson and Sarai his daughter-in-law toward Canaan, Lot came not as an independent patriarch, but as a dependent relative. They settled instead in Haran, a different place sharing the name of Lot's dead father, a prosperous trading city in northern Mesopotamia, roughly 550 miles northwest of Ur. There Terah died at the age of 205. According to Genesis 11:32, it was only after Terah's death that the defining moment arrived. Genesis 12 opens with God's direct call to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great." This was Abram's call, Abram's covenant, Abram's promise. Lot received no such divine commission. Yet when Abram departed at age 75, verse 5 records that he took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. Lot went with Abraham, not by divine mandate, but by familial attachment and, likely, pragmatic calculation. What prospects did a young man without direct inheritance have in Haran? Abraham offered protection, association with a charismatic leader who had received a divine promise, and the opportunity to build wealth in new territory. The text doesn't record Lot's age at this point, but he was old enough to have acquired his own possessions and people, servants, livestock, and goods that marked him as a man of some means. not a destitute dependent. The caravan that left Haran for Canaan around 2091 BCE, traditional dating, or sometime in the early to middle second millennium, critical scholarly dating, was substantial. Two wealthy households traveling together, bound by blood and mutual benefit, they arrived in Canaan during a famine. Genesis 12:10 states simply, "Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land." Lot presumably accompanied Abraham to Egypt, though the text doesn't explicitly mention him during the Egyptian episode. That story focuses on Abraham's deceptive claim that Sarah was his sister and Pharaoh's subsequent discovery of the lie. What matters for Lot's story is what happened in Egypt economically. Abraham left Egypt, according to Genesis 13:2, as very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. The text implies this wealth came partly from Pharaoh's gifts before the deception was revealed. Lot, traveling with Abraham, almost certainly shared in this windfall when they returned to Canaan, moving between Bethel and Ai, where Abraham had previously built an altar. Both men had become wealthy enough that the land couldn't support them together. Genesis 13:5-6 makes the problem explicit. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. This wasn't abstract incompatibility. Verse 7 specifies the concrete result. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The conflict was fundamentally about resources in a contested landscape. The text notes that the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land at that time, meaning Abraham and Lot weren't alone, but were managing large herds in territory already inhabited by indigenous peoples with their own claims to pasture and water. Every well, every grazing area became a potential flashpoint. The herdsmen, professional shepherds, and cattlemen employed by each patriarch were the ones in daily contact, competing for the best grass, the most accessible water sources. Their disputes threatened to escalate beyond their employer's control. Abraham, demonstrating both wisdom and generosity, proposed a solution. Genesis 13:8-9 records his words, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." This was remarkable magnanimity. As the senior patriarch, the one who had received God's promise, Abraham had every cultural right to choose first. Instead, he offered Lot first choice of the land. What happened next would define Lot's entire trajectory. The text slows down to emphasize the decision. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zor. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. The parenthetical note is ominous. The narrator, writing after the events, reminds us that this lush appearance was temporary, but Lot, making his choice in real time, saw only present advantage. The Jordan Plain offered everything a herdsman could want: abundant water from the river, verdant pastures, and proximity to established trading cities. Genesis 13:10-11 records the choice with stark simplicity. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. The verb "chose for himself" carries moral weight in Hebrew narrative. It emphasizes self-interest, autonomy from God's direction. Lot chose based on what his eyes saw, what his economic calculations suggested. He journeyed east. In biblical geography, east often symbolizes movement away from God's presence, as it did for Cain and later for the exiles. Lot's choice was strategic, not spiritual. The text immediately adds a crucial detail in verse 12. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. That final phrase, "moved his tent as far as Sodom," indicates gradual progression. Lot didn't immediately enter Sodom. He pitched his tent near it, close enough to benefit from the city's markets and protection while maintaining his semi-nomadic pastoral lifestyle. But the trajectory was set. Verse 13 adds the first explicit moral note. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Lot's initial settlement, as far as Sodom, represented a calculated risk. The cities of the Jordan Plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, formed a pentapolis, a confederation of 5 city-states that controlled the lucrative trade routes along the Dead Sea region. Archaeological surveys suggest this area, before whatever catastrophe befell it, supported agriculture through sophisticated irrigation from the Jordan River and seasonal wadis. The bitumen deposits, natural asphalt seeping from the ground, provided valuable export material used throughout the ancient Near East for waterproofing, construction, and even Egyptian mummification. For a wealthy herdsman like Lot, proximity to Sodom meant access to markets, military protection against raiding bands, and participation in a developed urban economy far beyond what the hill country of Canaan offered. But this prosperity existed within a framework of moral corruption. The text emphasizes repeatedly the nature of Sodom's wickedness becomes explicit later in the narrative. But Genesis 13 establishes the basic fact. The city was characterized by habitual, flagrant violation of fundamental moral standards. Standards the biblical text assumes are universally knowable, not merely Israelite religious law. The Hebrew phrase, wicked great sinners against the Lord, uses intensification for emphasis, not merely sinful but aggressively. Comprehensively devoted to evil, Lot's gradual compromise appears first in geography, then in residence. Genesis 14 suddenly interrupts the narrative with a geopolitical crisis that reveals how deeply Lot had integrated into urban life. Verses 1-2 introduce a coalition of 4 eastern kings: Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Tidal, king of Goyim, who made war against 5 local kings including Bera of Sodom and Bersha of Gomorrah. The historical accuracy of these names remains debated among scholars, with some seeing authentic second millennium memories and others viewing them as literary constructions. But the narrative function is clear, to show Lot's vulnerability within the city system. For 12 years, the cities of the plain had paid tribute to Chedorlaomer's coalition. In the 13th year, they rebelled. In the 14th year, the eastern kings responded with devastating force. Genesis 14:5-7 describes a military campaign that swept southward through Transjordan, defeating the Rephaim, Zuzim, Emim, and Horites before turning toward the Jordan Valley. The coalition's strategy was punitive and thorough, to crush the rebellion and plunder enough wealth to justify the long military expedition from Mesopotamia. The battle itself occurred in the valley of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. According to verse 3, verse 10 adds a vivid, tactically significant detail. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. The natural asphalt deposits that made the region wealthy became death traps during military rout. Soldiers fleeing the better-equipped eastern armies stumbled into sticky bitumen pits where they became trapped and helpless. The geographical specificity suggests eyewitness tradition. Someone remembered that particular feature of that particular battle. The Eastern Coalition won decisively. Genesis 14:11-12 records the consequences. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their provisions, and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. The text no longer says Lot pitched his tent near Sodom. It says he was dwelling in Sodom. At some point between chapters 13 and 14, Lot had abandoned semi-nomadic life and become a full urban resident. He now owned a house, as later chapters confirm, held a recognized position in city governance, sitting in the gate in chapter 19, and had accumulated the possessions worth plundering. His integration was complete, and it made him a target. News reached Abraham through an escapee. Someone fled the battlefield and came and told Abram the Hebrew. The ethnic designation, Hebrew, appears here for the first time in biblical text, possibly derived from the Akkadian Habiru, a term for semi-nomadic groups existing on the margins of settled society. Abraham, still living in his tents by the oaks of Mamre near Hebron, occupied a very different social position than his urbanized nephew, yet kinship demanded action. Abraham's response demonstrated both military capability and strategic thinking often overlooked in Sunday school versions. Genesis 14:14 states, "When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan." The number 318 indicates Abraham commanded a substantial private military force. Not an army in the formal sense, but a force larger than most raiding parties, comprising men trained for combat and loyal to his household. These weren't hired mercenaries, but born in his house, servants raised within Abraham's household structure, bound by personal loyalty and household identity. Abraham didn't act alone. Verse 13 mentions he was allied with Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, local Canaanite chieftains who were allies of Abram. These alliances reveal Abraham's diplomatic skill. He maintained cooperative relationships with indigenous peoples, based presumably on mutual benefit and respect, that could be activated in crisis. The text doesn't specify whether these allies joined the military expedition, but their mention establishes Abraham's integration into the regional political network. The pursuit covered over 120 miles north to Dan, near the sources of the Jordan, where Abraham caught up with the Eastern Coalition. His tactical approach showed sophisticated military thinking, and he divided his forces against them by night. He and his servants defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Genesis 14:15. A night attack against a larger force requires precise coordination, knowledge of enemy positions, and disciplined troops who can operate in darkness without confusion. Abraham's 318 achieved this. The phrase divided his forces suggests he split into multiple groups to attack from different directions, creating the impression of a larger force and preventing organized resistance. The Eastern kings, encumbered with plunder and captives, probably weren't expecting pursuit from a nomadic chieftain. Their forces were dispersed, celebrating victory, unprepared for sudden assault in darkness. Abraham's smaller, more cohesive force achieved tactical surprise and routed them. The pursuit continued another 50 miles to Hobah, near Damascus. Abraham pressed the advantage to ensure complete victory and maximum recovery of plunder. Genesis 14:16 records the outcome. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. The rescue was total. Lot, his household, other captives from Sodom, and the plundered wealth all returned. It was a stunning military achievement by any standard, a private force defeating a coalition that had subdued multiple kingdoms. The aftermath brought a mysterious and theologically significant encounter. As Abraham returned through the King's Valley near Jerusalem, two kings met him, Bera of Sodom and Melchizedek, king of Salem, Jerusalem, and priest of God Most High. The contrast between them structures the narrative's moral architecture. Bera, whose city Abraham had just saved, offered a pragmatic deal. "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." Verse 21. "Keep the plunder, return the people," standard ancient Near Eastern practice. The rescuer earned the spoils. Melchizedek offered something radically different. He brought out bread and wine, foreshadowing later biblical symbolism, and blessed Abraham. "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Verses 19-20. Abraham gave him a tenth of everything, the first biblical instance of tithing, and a recognition of Melchizedek's priestly authority. This enigmatic priest-king, worshiping God Most High, El Elyon in Hebrew, possibly the same deity Abraham worshipped under different names, represented legitimate spiritual authority outside the Abrahamic line itself. Abraham's response to Bera revealed his priorities. He had previously sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that he would take nothing from the king of Sodom, not a thread or a sandal strap, lest Bera claim credit for Abraham's wealth. Lest you should say, "I have made Abram rich." Verses 22-23. Abraham's wealth would come from God's blessing alone, not from association with Sodom's corrupt prosperity. He accepted only what his men had consumed and the share belonging to his Amorite allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. This was the moment Lot should have recognized the difference between Abraham's path and Sodom's. His uncle had just demonstrated military prowess, diplomatic wisdom, and spiritual integrity. Abraham had risked his life and his entire household military force to rescue a nephew, who had chosen Sodom's wealth over continued partnership. The contrast between Abraham's tent-dwelling, God-trusting lifestyle and Sodom's corrupt urbanity could not have been clearer. Yet the text records no response from Lot. No thanks, no reconsideration, no proposal to return to Abraham's camp. The narrative simply moves forward. Genesis doesn't explicitly state that Lot immediately returned to Sodom, but chapter 19 finds him there, more deeply integrated than ever. The rescue changed nothing in Lot's trajectory. He returned to the city, resumed his life, and apparently concluded that the recent military crisis was an aberration. Bad luck, not a warning. The text then leaves Lot's story for several chapters, focusing on Abraham's covenant, the birth of Ishmael, and the promise of Isaac, when the narrative returns to Lot in Genesis 18 to 19. Years have passed. Lot now sits in Sodom's gate, the city's civic center where elders conducted business, rendered judgments, and managed community affairs. He holds a recognized position of authority, suggesting either appointment or election to the city council. He owns a house substantial enough to host guests with multiple rooms. He has married, though his wife is never named, and has at least 2 daughters living at home, plus married daughters, or daughters betrothed, living elsewhere in the city. By conventional measures, Lot had succeeded. He had leveraged his initial choice of the well-watered plain into significant urban wealth and political influence. But Genesis 18 opens with an event that would seal Sodom's fate and reveal the depth of its corruption. 3 visitors appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre, the Lord and 2 angels in human form, though Abraham initially perceived them simply as travelers requiring hospitality. Abraham's response demonstrated ancient Near Eastern hospitality at its finest. He bowed, offered water for washing feet, arranged for rest in the shade, and personally supervised the preparation of an elaborate meal including cakes of fine flour, curds, milk, and a tender calf. He stood by while they ate, attentive to his guests' needs. During this visit, the Lord reaffirmed the promise that Sarah would bear a son within the year, the promise that provoked Sarah's famous skeptical laughter. But after the meal, the conversation took an ominous turn. Genesis 18:20-21 records the Lord's words, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." The language is forensic. An investigation prior to judgment, a divine commitment to verify accusations before acting. What follows is one of Scripture's most remarkable dialogues, Abraham's intercession for Sodom. As the 2 angels departed towards Sodom, Abraham still stood before the Lord and began negotiating. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it?" Verses 23-24. Abraham challenged divine justice itself. "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" The Lord agreed. 50 righteous would save the city. Abraham pressed further. "Suppose 45. The Lord agreed. 40. Agreed. 30. Agreed. 20. Agreed. Finally, Abraham reached his limit. "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again. But this once, suppose 10 are found there." The Lord responded, "For the sake of 10 I will not destroy it." Verse 32, 10 righteous people would save a city of thousands. Why did Abraham stop at 10? The text doesn't explain, but the number suggests a minimum community, a minyan in later Jewish tradition, the smallest unit capable of sustaining righteous influence. Perhaps Abraham calculated that Lot's household alone could reach 10. Lot, his wife, unmarried daughters, married daughters, sons-in-law? and perhaps servants loyal to Lot's God. Surely Lot, after years in Sodom, had influenced at least 10 people toward righteousness. Surely Abraham's nephew, who had witnessed God's covenant, who had been miraculously rescued, who now held civic authority, had created a pocket of righteousness within the corruption. The assumption would prove tragically wrong. Genesis 19 opens with the 2 angels arriving at Sodom in the evening. Lot was sitting in the gate, his position of authority. When he saw them, his response mirrored Abraham's hospitality. He rose, bowed, and urgently invited them to his house. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." Verse 2. The angels initially declined, saying they would spend the night in the town square, but Lot urged them strongly, and they agreed to come to his house. The Hebrew verb translated urged strongly conveys pressure, even compulsion. Lot knew something the angels, appearing as ordinary travelers, did not. He knew Sodom's streets were not safe. Lot prepared a feast with unleavened bread, quick bread made without the leavening time, suggesting either haste or perhaps proximity to Passover season in the agricultural calendar. But before they could sleep, the house was surrounded. Genesis 19:4 describes the scene with chilling comprehensiveness. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. This wasn't a gang of criminals or a particular neighborhood faction. The text emphasizes totality, young and old, all the people to the last man. The entire adult male population of Sodom mobilized for what came next. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." Verse 5. The Hebrew verb know, yada, carries sexual meaning in this context, the same verb used for Adam knowing Eve. The demand was for homosexual gang rape of the visitors, a grotesque violation of both hospitality norms and human dignity. This wasn't consensual relationship, but violent domination, using sexual assault as a weapon of power and humiliation against strangers. Lot's response revealed both his commitment to hospitality and his moral confusion shaped by years in Sodom. He went outside, closing the door behind him, and addressed the mob. "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Verses 7-8. Lot called them brothers. He identified with Sodom's people. He offered his virgin daughters to gang rape to protect male guests. The protective impulse toward guests was ancient and powerful, embedded in Near Eastern culture where hospitality created sacred obligations. But the willingness to sacrifice daughters revealed how thoroughly Sodom's values had corrupted Lot's moral reasoning. The mob's response showed they recognized Lot as perpetual outsider, despite his civic position. "Stand back. This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Verse 9. The accusation stung with truth. Lot was a resident alien, a sojourner who had presumed to judge their behavior. They pressed against him violently, threatening to break down the door. The situation had reached critical danger when the angels acted. They pulled Lot inside and struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. Verse 11. The supernatural blindness, not ordinary loss of sight, but disorientation so complete they couldn't even locate the door they'd been pressing against, provided temporary reprieve. The angels revealed their identity and mission. "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." Verses 12-13. The verification was complete. Sodom's evil was comprehensive, active, and unrepentant. Lot went to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and warned them, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." Verse 14. The text adds the crushing detail. but he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. Lot's credibility, even with his own family, was zero, whether because he'd never spoken of his uncle's God, or because his lifestyle contradicted any spiritual claims, or because Sodom's prosperity seemed so permanent. His sons-in-law dismissed the warning as a joke. They stayed as dawn approached. The angels urged Lot to hurry. "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." Verse 15. But even facing imminent divine judgment, Lot hesitated. The Hebrew verb in verse 16 is pointed. But he lingered, he delayed, attached to his house, his possessions, his position. Sodom had become home despite everything. The angels finally grabbed Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters by the hands, and brought them out and set them outside the city. The text explains, the Lord being merciful to him. Outside the city, one angel gave clear instructions. "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." Verse 17. The command was simple, urgent, non-negotiable. But Lot immediately began negotiating. "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." Verses 18-20. Even fleeing judgment, Lot craved urban security. The hills, where Abraham dwelt in tents, seemed too dangerous, too primitive. He negotiated for Zor, the smallest of the 5 cities of the plain, emphasizing its insignificance. "A little one," the angel agreed, making a striking concession. "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Verses 21-22. Divine judgment itself paused for Lot's arrival in Zor. The city's name would derive from this moment. Zor means little. The sun rose as Lot entered Zor. Then Genesis 19:24 records the catastrophe with spare, terrible simplicity. "Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground." The destruction was total. Not just the buildings, but the vegetation, the agricultural foundation of urban life. Scholars debate the mechanism: volcanic activity, earthquake triggering natural gas explosions, divine intervention using natural means, or direct supernatural action. The text doesn't explain the physics, only the result: comprehensive annihilation. The precise location of Sodom and Gomorrah remains unknown despite numerous archaeological claims. Candidates include sites at the southern Dead Sea now submerged by rising water levels, the plain north of the Dead Sea, or locations destroyed so completely that no archaeological trace remains identifiable. What's certain is that the region's unusual geology, high sulfur content, bitumen deposits, salt formations, seismic activity, provided the natural setting for whatever disaster occurred. Lot's wife, fleeing behind him, disobeyed the explicit command not to look back. Genesis 19:26 states, "But Lot's wife, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt." The text provides no elaboration, no description of the process, no explanation of why she looked, no record of her name. She's remembered only as Lot's wife, and for her fatal backward glance, the salt pillars common in the Dead Sea region, unusual formations created by salt deposits that can vaguely resemble human figures, gave rise to later traditions identifying specific pillars as Lot's wife. But the text itself offers only the fact. She looked back and became salt, whether through sudden burial in salt-laden volcanic ash, mineral encrustation, or direct transformation. Abraham witnessed the destruction from his distant vantage point near Hebron. Genesis 19:27-28 records that he rose early and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord, looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a kiln. The comparison to a pottery kiln suggests intense, concentrated heat producing thick, billowing smoke visible for miles. Abraham saw the physical evidence of divine judgment on cities he had once rescued militarily. The text adds in verse 29, "So it was that, when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Lot survived not by his own righteousness, but because God remembered Abraham's intercession. But survival didn't mean restoration. Lot's losses were catastrophic. His wife dead, his married daughters dead, his sons-in-law dead, his house destroyed, his civic position obliterated, his wealth consumed in fire. He arrived in Zoar with only his 2 virgin daughters and whatever they carried. And even in Zoar, safety proved illusory. Genesis 19:30 states, "Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar, so he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. The man who had negotiated to avoid the hills ended up there anyway, dwelling in a cave. The ultimate regression from his former urban sophistication. Why did Lot fear Zoar? The text doesn't explain. Perhaps he feared Zoar would face judgment too as the last remaining city of the plain. Perhaps Zoar's inhabitants, knowing the other cities had been destroyed for wickedness, blamed Lot as the outsider whose presence brought divine attention. Perhaps Lot's psychological state, having witnessed total destruction, lost his wife, and fled with traumatized daughters, made even a small city feel dangerous, whatever the reason. Abraham's nephew, who had chosen the well-watered plain for its prosperity, now lived in primitive isolation, a cave dweller depending on whatever they had salvaged, his daughters having lost everything, their mother, their fiancés, their home, their entire social world, faced a different crisis. Genesis 19:31 records the elder daughter's analysis. "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth." Her statement reveals a catastrophically narrow worldview. She believed they were alone, that no men existed anywhere to provide them with husbands and children. This wasn't rational assessment, but trauma-induced tunnel vision. Abraham lived perhaps 40 miles away with his substantial household. That certainly included marriageable men. Other Canaanite settlements existed throughout the region, but having witnessed apocalyptic destruction, isolated in a cave. The daughters apparently concluded normal social structures had collapsed entirely. Their solution was incest. The elder daughter proposed it explicitly. "Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." Verse 32. The stated motive, preserving the family line, echoed the cultural imperative to continue one's lineage, particularly urgent given their father's age and lack of male heirs. But the method violated fundamental sexual boundaries recognized across ancient Near Eastern cultures. Father-daughter incest appears in other ancient literature, like the Ugaritic myths, but always as transgressive, often bringing curse or disaster. The plan unfolded across 2 nights with methodical precision. On the first night, they made their father drink wine. Then the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Verse 33. Lot was intoxicated to the point of unconsciousness, unable to recognize his daughter, unable to prevent or participate knowingly in the act. The next night they repeated the process. They made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Verse 35. Both daughters conceived. The text narrates this without explicit moral commentary, letting the horror speak for itself. The daughters weren't portrayed as villains. They acted from desperation born of trauma and isolation, but their actions demonstrated how thoroughly their time in Sodom had corrupted their moral reasoning. They had absorbed Lot's utilitarian ethics, the same thinking that had offered them to the mob, and applied it to their own situation. Lot himself was reduced to passive victim, too drunk to consent or resist. The agency he once exercised in choosing the Jordan Valley now completely absent. The elder daughter bore a son named Moab, meaning from father. The younger bore Ammon. Genesis 19:37-38 adds the significant detail. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son. and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. These incestuous unions produced two nations that would become Israel's hostile neighbors for centuries. The Moabites occupied the territory east of the Dead Sea. Frequently in conflict with Israel, the Ammonites settled northeast of Moab. Both peoples worshipped gods like Chemosh and Moloch, deities whose worship sometimes included child sacrifice, echoing in later generations the moral corruption that characterized their origins. The biblical narrative treats this origin story as explaining the Moabites' and Ammonites' relationship to Israel, cousins by blood through Abraham's brother's line, but cousins born from violation, carrying the legacy of Sodom's corruption. Deuteronomy 23:3 would later prohibit Ammonites and Moabites from entering Israel's assembly, even to the 10th generation, citing their failure to provide hospitality during the Exodus. Yet Ruth the Moabitess would become King David's great-grandmother, demonstrating that even corrupted lineages could produce individuals who chose covenant faithfulness. Lot himself disappears from the narrative after the cave episode. The text records no death notice, no burial, no final words. He simply vanishes, his story ending not with dignity but with drunken unconsciousness and incestuous paternity. The man who began as Abraham's companion, who had prospered materially, who had held civic office in a wealthy city, ended as a cave dweller who fathered children through his own daughters while unconscious. It was a complete reversal. Prosperity to destitution, honor to shame, active choice to passive victimhood. Later biblical tradition offered conflicting assessments of Lot. 2 Peter 2:7-8 calls him righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. For as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. This interpretation emphasizes Lot's internal distress, his spiritual discomfort with Sodom's evil, suggesting he remained righteous despite his environment. But this charitable reading sits uneasily beside Genesis's portrayal of a man who chose Sodom repeatedly, integrated fully into its civic life, showed no evidence of prophetic witness against its evil, and ended in moral catastrophe. The more coherent reading sees Lot as a tragic figure whose compromises accumulated into disaster. Each choice seemed rational at the time. Choosing the well-watered plain maximized economic opportunity. Settling near Sodom provided security. Moving into the city offered full participation in urban prosperity. Accepting civic office gave him influence. Yet each choice distanced him from Abraham's covenant path and immersed him deeper in corrupt culture. He never committed Sodom's characteristic sins himself. The text doesn't accuse him of homosexual rape, violence, or injustice. His sin was subtler. He accommodated himself to evil, profited from wicked systems, and failed to maintain prophetic distance from corruption. The story's moral architecture reveals several layers. First, prosperity divorced from righteousness leads to catastrophe. Sodom's wealth couldn't save it from judgment. Second, incremental compromise, settling near evil. Then among evil, then as part of evil's systems, corrupts even good intentions. Third, the righteous man in a wicked city becomes so compromised he can't effectively witness against its evil or protect his own family from its values. Fourth, deliverance from judgment doesn't automatically restore what compromise destroyed. Lot lost everything except bare survival. Now we must separate what the Genesis text actually says from the myths and speculations that have accumulated around Lot's story over 3,000 years. First, regarding Lot's wife, the text does not explain the mechanism of her transformation into salt. Later traditions identifying specific salt pillars near the Dead Sea as Lot's wife are pious speculation, not biblical data. The text states the fact without explaining the process, whether literal petrification, mineral burial, or metaphorical description of sudden death. We don't know, and honest interpretation acknowledges this limit. Second, regarding Sodom's location, despite numerous archaeological claims over the past century, no site has been definitively identified as Sodom or Gomorrah. Candidates include Bab ed-Dra and Numera, near the southeastern Dead Sea, which show evidence of destruction by fire around 2350-2067 BCE in the early Bronze Age, but the dating doesn't align perfectly with standard Abraham chronology, and the evidence is ambiguous. Other scholars suggest sites now submerged by the Dead Sea's rising levels, or locations so completely destroyed that no archaeological trace survived. The honest answer is, we don't know where Sodom was, which means we cannot verify the destruction archaeologically. Third, regarding the nature of Sodom's sin, later Jewish and Christian tradition sometimes reduced it exclusively to homosexual practice, creating the term sodomy. But biblical texts that reference Sodom emphasize comprehensive wickedness. Ezekiel 16:49 states, "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." The prophet saw Sodom's sin as including arrogance, inhospitality, oppression of the poor, and comprehensive injustice. The attempted gang rape was the climactic expression of deeper systemic evil, not the totality of their wickedness. Fourth, regarding Lot's righteousness. 2 Peter's assessment represents theological interpretation from a New Testament perspective, emphasizing grace and struggle against sin. It's legitimate theological reflection, but goes beyond what Genesis explicitly states. Genesis portrays Lot as a man who made poor choices, showed moments of hospitality and concern, inviting the angels, but fundamentally compromised his values through association with evil. Whether his soul was tormented internally while he sat in Sodom's gate is a question Genesis doesn't address. Fifth, regarding the cave incest. Some later interpreters tried to soften this episode by suggesting Lot was somehow less culpable, or that the daughter's desperation completely excused their action. But the text presents it as straightforward incest. The daughters deliberately intoxicated their father to unconsciousness and sexually assaulted him across 2 nights. Lot's lack of consent doesn't make him morally guilty of the incest, but his inability to prevent it resulted from his drunkenness, which was itself morally questionable. The daughters acted from trauma, induced desperation, but their action remained fundamentally wrong by the biblical text's own moral framework. Sixth, regarding the number of righteous in Sodom, Abraham negotiated down to 10, but the text never explicitly states whether even 10 righteous existed. The implication, given that Lot's own sons-in-law rejected his warning, is that not even 10 could be found. Lot himself, his wife, and his 2 daughters made 4. If the sons-in-law had believed and come, that might have reached 6 to 8. But finding 10 genuine righteous people in a city where all the people to the last man participated in attempted gang rape proved impossible. What can we verify from sources beyond Genesis? Ancient Near Eastern texts occasionally reference cities in the Jordan Plain region, and the Dead Sea area's unusual geology is well documented. The destruction of cities by earthquake, fire, or volcanic activity in this seismically active region is geologically plausible. Several ancient cities in the region show archaeological evidence of catastrophic destruction, though connecting any specific site to biblical Sodom remains speculative. The best we can say is that the geographical and geological setting makes the account plausible, but archaeological verification remains elusive. Lot's story endures because it dramatizes timeless moral dynamics, the seduction of prosperity, the danger of incremental compromise, the cost of choosing material advantage over spiritual integrity, and the way corrupt cultures reshape moral reasoning. Even in those who don't fully embrace their evil, his life poses uncomfortable questions. At what point does living among wickedness become complicity with it? Can you participate in corrupt systems while maintaining personal righteousness? What are you willing to sacrifice for prosperity? And what will it cost in the end? The nephew who chose the well-watered plain became a cave-dwelling father of hostile nations. The man who sat in Sodom's gate lost everything in fire from heaven. His wife became salt. His married daughters died in judgment. His remaining daughters bore his children through incestuous assault, and his name became synonymous with compromise and catastrophe. Whatever righteousness Peter saw in Lot, Genesis shows us a man whose choices led to ruin. A cautionary tale about prosperity without principle, position without prophetic witness, and the devastating cost of accommodating evil. Write in the comments, Do you think Lot deserves to be called righteous? Or does his story reveal someone who compromised too deeply to maintain that label? And what would you have done differently if you'd been Abraham's nephew, facing the choice between the well-watered plain and continued life in your uncle's tents?